So our next item for consideration is H.R. 2249, the Preserving Presidential Management Authority Act. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 2249, a bill to amend Chapter 71 of Title V, United States Code, to provide that the President may unilaterally modify collective bargaining agreements entered into under such chapter and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2249 is offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment. Federal employee unions focus on advancing the interest of government employees who belong to the union at the expense of government management and mission achievement. Collective bargaining agreements, or CBAs, are negotiated by federal employee unions and frequently result in civil service policies that prevent poorly performing federal employees from being held accountable and conflict with the policy priorities of newly elected presidents. For instance, the outgoing Biden-Harris administration finalized long-term CBAs with federal employee unions in an attempt to limit President Trump's management authority. In these CBAs, the Biden-Harris administration made unprecedented concessions, including guaranteeing telework for federal bureaucrats. Specifically, outgoing Social Security Administration Chief Martin O'Malley approved an agreement with the American Federation of Government Employees that seeks to lock in minimum telework levels for 42,000 Social Security Administration employees until 2029. The agreement was finalized on November 27, 2024, just days before O'Malley stepped down from his job at the SSA. This highlights everything problematic about federal sector collective bargaining, agreements that tie the hands of future executive branch policymakers. A duly elected president should not be constrained by a union deal with federal employees made by the prior administration on the way out. This bill, the Preserving Presidential Management Authority Act, would ensure that a duly elected president is not bound by CBAs negotiated under the previous administration. CBAs cannot run counter to federal law, including newly passed statutes. This bill reform will also ensure that the CBAs cannot counter presidential policy, including executive orders and presidential memorandums. I thank Mr. Cloud from Texas for his leadership in preparing this new legislation for the committee's consideration. These are necessary and reasonable reforms, and I urge my colleagues to support the Preserving Presidential Management Authority Act. I now recognize Ms. Crockett for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Preserving Presidential Management Authority Act is simply another effort by Republicans in Congress to attack and attempt to eliminate federal government unions. The bill would specify that an incoming president may terminate provisions of public sector collective bargaining agreements, or CBAs, signed prior to the president's term of office. In doing so, it would give the president unilateral authority to terminate any provision of a CBA that the president doesn't like. I remind my colleagues that collective bargaining agreements are legally binding agreements, and the president already has the power to renegotiate provisions of CBAs based on new management priorities. For example, if the president signs an executive order to change telework policies, he or she already has the power to renegotiate a CBA provision relating to telework flexibilities, even if it's bad policy. The bill also provides the president or an agency head unilateral authority to render any provision of a CBA unenforceable simply because they deem it in conflict with an executive order or presidential memorandum. Perhaps, for example, the National Border Patrol Council entered into a collective bargaining agreement with the federal government, which included a provision requiring periodic rest breaks for agents and personnel when working in extreme heat and humidity. If the Secretary of Homeland Security stated in an agency memorandum that they no longer believe in providing workplace health and safety programs, those Border Patrol agents and personnel with one swipe of a pen would have their rest breaks taken away. This is just one example of an alarming effort by congressional Republicans to take away the voices and rights of federal workers. As President Trump and his administration attempt to consolidate power in the executive branch, the American public must be reassured that the president and his agency heads are not above the law. Federal unions don't have the power to terminate any provision of a CBA they dislike, and private sector employers certainly don't have the power over private sector unions either. This concept for this legislation was raised by Republicans in a hearing earlier this year in the Trump administration's effort to dismantle our government. Republicans used the hearing to push a conspiracy theory that the Biden administration saddled the Trump administration with collective bargaining agreements that would tie President Trump's hands. The hearing exposed that conspiracy and laid bare the fact that the collective bargaining agreement in question was previously negotiated by the Trump administration and extended far into the Biden administration. So what the majority has done is invent a problem and use it as justification for an executive branch power grab. This legislation would have extremely alarming implications for Americans employed by the federal government and is, put simply, a public sector union-busting effort. I oppose this legislation, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Well, do we have any on this side first? Oh, I'm sorry. I recognize the sponsor of the bill, the most important person on the bill, Mr. Cloud from Texas.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Certainly not the most important person, but I would like to speak to the bill. And thank you for your words at the beginning. Appreciate it. This is an important bill, something that needs to be done. The Preserving Presidential Management Authority Act would ensure that the duly elected president is not bound by collective bargaining agreements negotiated under a previous presidential administration. This is important, and we can see most recently that in the last days of the Joe Biden presidency, his administration worked around the clock to saddle President Trump with onerous collective bargaining agreements. As you mentioned, Chairman, for example, in December 2024, a month before Trump was to take office, the Social Security Administration Commissioner, Martin O'Malley, signed a collective bargaining agreement to look into pandemic-era telework policies for 42,000 federal employees, oddly, until 2029, the entire duration of President Trump's term. Again, on January 17th, 2025, 3 days before Trump was to take office, the Department of Education signed a collective bargaining agreement with AFGE until 2030. Even Politico ran an article titled, "The Fed's Race to Ink Union Deals That Last Beyond Trump," which documented CBAs and negotiations with the EPA, National Park Service, Federal Regulatory Commission, and the Bureau of Land Management. It's not just telework that's the issue. As we've established in other committee hearings, these unions that have been negotiating these CBAs have demonstrated a clear political bias. AFGE, the largest federal union workforce, has donated over $3 million to PACs since the 2020 cycle. Of that total, 95% went to Democrats. AFG also endorsed Kamala Harris for president, which they certainly had the right to do, but it's notable that in 2020 they endorsed Biden, 2016 they endorsed Hillary, 2012 and 2008 they endorsed President Barack Obama. So we're seeing a trend here. This is a political organization that is, as much as it is a union for our workforce. Additionally, the National Treasury Employees Union has donated over $700,000 to PACs in the 2020 cycle. Almost 99% of the money was given to Democrat organizations. It's clear we need a solution to these midnight CBAs, which only serve to ensnare President Trump and his agenda. My bill allows any incoming president to terminate any provision of a CBA and nullifies provisions of a CBA which conflict with rule, executive order, or presidential memorandum. This bill ensures that existing CBAs do not conflict with any incoming presidential policy. And ultimately, this really comes down to the fact that elections matter, and the Article 2 of our Constitution gives an executive, the President of the United States, the authority to execute the laws of the land and to administer his administration. And so it is important that no previous president, regardless of if I like the policies of that president or not, be encumbered by a previous president's contracts and agreements with the federal workforce. And so this bill seeks to amend that and ensure that any incoming president has the ability to revisit those contracts and to renegotiate them if necessary. And thank you, Chairman, for the time and for your consideration of this, this bill in committee markup today. And I yield back.
Thank the sponsor of the bill. Yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Lynch. Then we'll go to Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as someone who has negotiated collective bargainings for a living, I just want to point out that this would put both the government and the contracting party, in this case the unions, at a severe disadvantage. As we all know, sometimes it takes years to negotiate a contract with a large labor union, unfortunately, because of the rights involved and the number of employees involved. So it is quite common that an administration, such as the Trump administration, might need 18 months or 2 years to negotiate a contract with a government employee union. What this would do would be to basically abrogate the Fifth Amendment rights to have their contract rights respected, and also to attain due process in the abrogation of those rights. It's the nature of our government that when administrations change, we oftentimes have a new view that comes into play, especially when the administration changes from either a Republican to a Democrat or from a Democrat to a Republican administration. This amendment is totally unworkable in terms of trying to create some predictability for the government that would also respect the rights of the employees involved. To have the President of the United States and Congress, approve a contract with a labor union, and then because of the vagaries of a next election, have that completely blown up is a complete destruction of the rights that are embodied in that contract. So, this bill the bill is confusing and unworkable from a practical aspect, and it would effectively render all collective bargaining agreements meaningless. In other words, you have a contract until we say you don't. That's what this bill does. Bargaining involves negotiation. It involves compromise by all parties. A lot of times those employees are locked into very low wage increases over 4 or 5 years. And so by adopting this bill, you would deny the government of that advantage that they have gained through negotiations and executing an agreement with that union. So it's not just, it implies that you're just taking the rights away from the union. You're actually taking rights away from the government itself from losing the advantage that might be gained in a collective bargaining agreement of multiple years with the particular union. As I said, bargaining involves negotiation. It involves compromise by all parties, resulting in a signed contract that balances those interests. By design, no one is necessarily happy with all the terms of a collective bargaining agreement. This bill will result in management being able to subvert a new management. So a party not party to the original contract can come in and just tear that up, even though it was signed by a person of authority and valid when executed. After the fact, it could be simply negated, simply by obtaining a new presidential order. So this bill is an affront to the basic principles of contract law. And remember, we in that collective bargaining agreement, we restate that those employees don't have the right to strike. They don't have the right to stop work. They are bound by that agreement and by statute. And this, this rewriting of the law would negate all those rights that protect the employees and the union within that agreement, but also the predictability and the advantage gained by the taxpayer as well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yield back. Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, does anyone else want to speak on the cloud bill? All right, good.
We got one.
So
Sorry.
we'll halt on that.
On the amendment, you get to.
Okay. Go ahead.
Chairman,
Pete.
this bill at its core is about giving the president the authority to try to screw over workers in the middle of a contract. We don't have a bill here before us today to give the president the authority to go and change contracts with big businesses that do business with the government, because those are the big businesses that fund so many of my Republican colleagues' campaigns. But what you're looking at right here is a bill to come and tell frontline employees that even though they bargained and organized and did all of this work to be able to win a set of wages and benefits and working conditions, that the Republican majority wants to be able to come and undercut those working conditions for those workers. Look, in a private company, it's been the law of the land for nearly 100 years that if you organize a union, if you organize and come to a collective bargaining agreement, that if a new owner comes in and buys the company, those workers should have the right to continue to have their wages and working conditions honored in their collective bargaining agreements. And so it makes no sense why here we would just give a president the authority, not because there's a particular problem identified, just to give the president carte blanche authority to come in and change terms and conditions for workers that have already been organized, that have already been agreed to, that have already been bargained for, and not say, well, why don't we take a look at the way that we're being overcharged in some of these contracts? But there would be a whole uprising of corporate lobbyists and special interest groups here before us today if we said we're going to go take a look at the way that Big Pharma is overcharging Medicare and Medicaid. We'd have that whole fleet of people. But instead, the Republican majority says we're going to go pick on working people, go pick on workers, whether in the public or in the private sector. And so I know that President Trump has gone out campaigning saying that he's for the working person, but these first rafts of bills in the Oversight Committee, they don't seem to be about actually saving people money. They seem to be about going and, picking on working people that have negotiated their contracts. And I just don't see how the Republican Party can claim to be the party of working people while they're going out of their way to screw over workers in this way. Thank you. I yield back.